results show the Goshen divide. The Democrats in districts 1, 2, and 3 lost by about 20 points, while the Democrats in districts 4 and 5 won by over 20 points. Also, the total vote in districts 4 and 5 were about 16% more than the total vote in the 3 districts won by Republicans. I look forward to hearing Shannon's experiences from the city council election and other things she learned in 2023. So please welcome Shannon back to Sojourners.
Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. That's always the first item of business, making sure everybody can hear. It's very good to be back. It's been a little while since I've been here, and now we're in a new room, even closer to the door. So thank you for welcoming me in. My husband, Corey Martin, is with me today. He decided to tag along at the last minute. You can wave, Corey. Some of you know Corey. He's the chaplain at the Elkhart County Jail. I was very glad he wanted to join me. And for one thing, he drove me here. That's always kind of nice. On the way over, I said, "You're going to steal my thunder at this class." And he said, "Oh, I don't have to come if you don't want me to." I was joking, but a lot more of you probably know of Corey than you might know of me. So we're kind of a joint package deal here. We are just coming this morning directly from the Sunday school class that we don't think of ourselves as leading it. How do you generally present that? We facilitate a Sunday school class at La Casa, right across from the work release facility for people in work release. And we've been doing that maybe since the first of the year. And it's a joy. That's become our faith community right now. It's become just a profound joy to spend every Sunday morning with our incarcerated neighbors, and we learn a lot from them. So we've had a full morning already. It's good to be here with you. So yes, I'm going to dive in. Can you remind me, Mark, when should I stop talking? Okay. Do you have what's the rough idea, just so I can kind of keep my eye on the time? Okay, perfect. And I don't want to talk at you for the entire time. I want to leave opportunity for conversation and questions, because this is a local conversation that we're about to have. So yeah, we'll just get into it. But if you have questions along the way, even while I'm talking, I'm perfectly flexible and happy to answer questions as we go, and we'll leave time for that at the end as well. So I'm going to begin by reading a passage from scripture that I have seen as sort of my thesis for what does it look like to be a Christ follower? What does it look like for people who come up in the faith? We hear, and throughout my life, and I mean, throughout my entire life, I've heard, that kind of the point here is to love God and love our neighbor. And Mark made the point earlier, we really can't love our neighbor if we don't know our neighbor. For a very long time, I sort of hoped that not hating my neighbor counted as loving my neighbor. And I mean that very seriously. I didn't fully understand what does it mean and why does it matter, but I don't hate anybody. I'm not actively mean to anybody. Does that count, God? That's kind of how I sort of looked at things. And so when my family moved into the neighborhood, the Chamberlain neighborhood on the north side of Goshen about 13, 14 years ago, our kids were tiny. We had preschooler, kindergartner, and a second grader beginning school at Chamberlain Elementary. And some of this is going to be repeat information, but it's an important context for me to begin with. Us moving from Wakarusa, Indiana, out in the country, and what we thought of as our dream farmhouse where we would raise our children and live kind of forever. We ended up being wrong about that. We lived there for just 4 short years, and then we uprooted our family and moved not so far up the road, but in many, many ways to a very different way of living. moving into a low-income neighborhood that a lot of people would consider to be on the wrong side of the tracks. And that's language that I have even used in the past, and I understand it. And I also have come to see that I very much live on the right side of the tracks. We love our neighborhood. Our neighbors have changed our lives and changed the way we see this world. And so as I've kind of dug deeper into over these past 13 years, why does God care so much that we love our neighbors? And who is our neighbor? You know, the classic question from the story of the Good Samaritan, who is our neighbor? I think a lot of times when we ask that question, we're essentially saying, how close do we have to get to each other? How close is close enough? So beginning to ask the question, who is my neighbor? Why does this matter? What do we have to learn from each other? I have come to see a short passage in the book of Jeremiah as the roadmap that we're given for what does it really look like to live as neighbors. And because we are sharing space today right now, we are all neighbors. I use that word very loosely. So a lot of times I'm talking about my next door neighbors on North 5th Street. A lot of times I'm talking about the city of Goshen, and all of these ideas are going to kind of coalesce when I move into some of the conversation around my choice to run for city council. But let's just begin here. I'm going to read just a few little verses here. This is from, like I said, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29. This is titled A Letter to the Exiles. So these are God's words through the prophet Jeremiah to the people who are the Israelites in exile in Babylon. And I just spoke about this a little bit yesterday at another event. And I think most of us can understand to varying degrees this idea of living in, excuse me, I'm recovering from a bug. Excuse me. The idea of living in a place that we may not have chosen, living in a place that we might not feel welcomed, living in a place that we might rather not live, living in a place of some complication or confusion. We can relate to that idea in many ways. And yet I want to remind us not to overly identify as exiles, because I think this is an important note for an important group of people. And yet there's something that we can learn from this. So this is what God says to us. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Multiply, do not dwindle away. And work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare determines your welfare. If I had to summarize in just a few sentences, what does it look like to really identify, to live into our spiritual identity of neighbor? That is our calling. No matter what our vocation might be, no matter how we might spend our time and spend our days, I fully believe that God has given God's children the calling of neighbor. That is part of our spiritual DNA. And this gives us sort of a roadmap for what it looks like to do that together. In particular, that last little portion, work for the peace and prosperity of your city. Pray to the Lord for it. I always appreciate that it says work first and then pray, because what that tells us is that praying is just simply not enough. We have a job to do. We have an obligation to get involved, to invest our lives. And I'm happy and comfortable being here in this space today because I know that this is a group of people who understand that. So yes, Jeremiah 29, those were verses 5 through 7. Yep. Yeah, thank you for that. I don't think I made that quite clear enough. So I have a couple of notes here on my phone that I'm going to kind of keep myself on track with. I'm going to begin for me, what was the beginning of the story of how did Shannon Martin from the Chamberlain neighborhood decide to run for city council? And I'm going to give you as much of the story as I can without boring you, giving unnecessary details. But what I will tell you is that I was invited in a previous term, in a previous election, to run for city council. And so I was invited into meetings with people, you know, people with some amount of power, people making decisions and kind of trying to steer that conversation. And in that initial conversation, it was an easy and clear no thank you from me. I had children who were younger. I was probably in a different phase. A lot of my life as an author revolves around, am I under a deadline? So it's possible that I was under a deadline during that time. And when an author is under a deadline, an author should not choose to run for public office or do anything else that takes a lot of time. I don't remember specifically what the parameters of my life were that caused me to say no, but it was a very quick no. And so I don't remember even, quite honestly, if it was 4 years later or 8 years later. I think it was 8 years later, I was invited again into a meeting to sit down and talk about, would I consider running for city council? And so I said to the person who invited me into that meeting, the answer is really probably no again, but I will sit down and hear you out. And so I did sit down, I had the conversation, and I said at the end, you know, I appreciate your time. I appreciate that you thought of me. My answer is still no. Then an additional layer of reinforcement comes in. A different person says, would you be willing to sit down and talk with me about you potentially running for city council? And this person was Julia King. She's a good friend of mine. And I said, well, as you know, Julia, the answer is probably no, but I'm happy to sit down with you and hear you out. We meet for coffee every now and then anyway. It was a good opportunity to catch up. And so we sat down over tea at the Brew, and she gave me kind of her ideas behind all of this. And at the end, I said, well, I really appreciate you thinking of me, and my answer is no. My answer is still no. So I was called into a third and final meeting. And I sat through that particular meeting. And as I was, you know, I was hearing this person out and trying to keep an open mind, trying to stay open to what life might have for me. And just, I could not quite make the connection. I had a real hard time, to be candid with you. Aside from my life was in a little bit of a better rhythm, it was a better time for me to run. I really struggled with being another white person running for public office, particularly in District 3. That had been part of my rationale from the beginning. And I just would have preferred to find a Latino neighbor who is interested in running, because I think representation is of the utmost importance in our community. In my family, Corey and I are the white parents of 4 non-white children. And so we really actively pay attention to the representation our children feel. And in my neighborhood, which is increasingly Latino, I just couldn't quite make sense of it. And so that was one of my big hurdles. And so I sat in this meeting, and there were a lot of good explanations for why maybe that shouldn't quite be the hurdle that I was allowing it to be. It was not completely connecting for me. And I left that meeting still feeling like, yeah, my answer is still kind of no. And I sat down in my van to get ready to drive back to my house. And I had a text message from my supervisor at the window. So I also do work on staff part-time at the window as a cook. And she said to me, her name is Crystal, and this was completely random timing. She said, do you think we could ever get the mayor to start coming to lunch at the window? And I'm sitting outside of the mayor's office in the parking lot. And all of a sudden, these ideas kind of lock into place for me. And I had struggled to identify my why. Like, why does it make sense for me, for Shannon Martin, to run for city council? When I feel like, you know, I'm actively working against representation, these different barriers. And I suddenly understood that I have close proximity and real true friendship with a community within this city that is unrepresented and underheard. And it's the clients at the window. It is our unhoused neighbors. It is people who struggle in different ways than most of us have struggled. And that little text message sitting in that parking lot locked things into place for me. And I knew, I was 99% sure at that point that I was probably going to say yes. I was going to give it my best shot. I was still going to think about it over the weekend. That weekend I was visiting with some friends in Grand Rapids, and I got a text message just out of the blue on a Saturday afternoon from Mayor Jeremy Stutzman, the mayor at that time. And he said, "Hey, I have a book recommendation for you." And I thought, well, that's great, because the whole time I was meeting with him, I was like secretly trying to look at the books on his bookshelves in his offices. I'm a writer and I'm an avid reader, and I saw some interesting titles. And so I thought, I wonder what in the world book he's about to recommend to me. And so he sent me a picture from a page in my book where I wrote, and I'll read this little section to you. This is towards the back of the book, a section titled an incomplete list of tips for everyday activism. And in one of those sections, I wrote, "It's important to resist locally, but equally important to do what we can to disrupt toxic systems around us. Follow candidates and vote in local elections. Run for office. Sign petitions, contact politicians. March, protest. When done collectively, these actions can and do bring about actual change." And so he had highlighted with a highlighter, "Run for office," and then sent it to me and used my own words against me. And at that point, it sort of sealed my fate. And I knew I was going to go ahead and jump in and run. So what did I learn in running as a candidate for local office? I learned it is a tremendously time-consuming endeavor. It takes a lot of time. And this is just the reality of it. If I'm going to agree to do anything, I'm going to pour my whole heart into that work. One of the things that kept popping up throughout this process, I was brand new. Corey and I both used to work. I worked more adjacent to politics. Corey worked in politics. I'm very politically interested and curious and aware. And yet I did not know much about running a campaign. There are similarities between launching a book and running a political campaign. I did learn that. But I just don't think it was possible for me to fully realize and appreciate the amount of time it was going to take. And yet I don't regret a single minute of that time. So we collectively worked, the Working for Goshen team, the Democrat Party, which was what I ran as a part of that ticket. We worked together. We met together regularly, very regularly. And so one of the takeaways that I have, and one of my brightest takeaways, is that there were other wonderfully engaged, connected, caring, empathetic, curious, intelligent, active members of this community who are like-minded to me in many ways. And I had no idea they were here. They were just right out here. They were in my community. Some of them I knew kind of from a distance. Others I had never met and were meeting for the first time. And anytime we get a chance to connect with people who care about the things we care about, that's a gift that we get to take with us. So that was one of my greatest takeaways, was that we really did do this as a team. And that made a real difference for me. Even though I'm one of the people who did not win, it made a difference for me to be a part of a team who wanted to see Goshen move in ever healthier and ever brighter directions. As Mark mentioned, I had to kind of look up this statistic. I thought I remembered it, but I wanted to get it exactly right. Throughout the course of the campaign, one of the things that I heard over and over again, and it was a little intense at times, and it put some pressure on me, and I'm okay with that. One of the things I heard was District 3 is winnable for a Democrat. District 3 is winnable. It was kind of seen as like, people would say District 3 could tip the balance within our city council. And so it was always mentioned by name, District 3, last time District 3 was lost by 2 votes. I heard that over and over and over again. And so that was a highly motivating factor for me to just stay active, to stay out there, to spend a lot of my free time in those last several months walking around my neighborhood, walking door to door, asking people to support me in different ways, asking for help, which is never easy for any of us, really. In the very end, I ended up losing not by 2 votes. I lost by about 15 percentage points. And so that was something that was unexpected in some ways. The minute we found out that I had lost, and this was interesting to me. I don't know quite what to make of this, but that evening at the party that we had at Ignition Garage, within moments of finding out that District 3, Shannon had lost, the conversation turned to gerrymandering. And this was not something I had heard much about throughout the campaign. And all of a sudden, people were saying, I mean, people that I had spent a lot of time with were saying, well, but the district was gerrymandered since the last election. And so it's interesting to me that I didn't particularly know that until the moment that we realized I had lost. And not only had I lost, it was not close. One of the things as a human person, as a driven and independent person, I'm interested in winning. I wanted to win. A lot of people around me were just very sure that I was going to win. You know, this was going to change everything in Goshen. And one of the things I would say to Corey throughout this campaign was, even if I lose, I just want it to be close. Just want it to be close. And that was an issue of personal pride. I just did not want to be embarrassed. And so to find out that I had not only lost, but that I had lost by a significant margin, it was kind of like my worst nightmare scenario. And what I realized pretty quickly that night was I was not embarrassed at all. In some ways, it took the pressure off of, you know, we hear about things like recounts and, you know, that was part of the process for District 3 in the previous election. Things can get so contentious, as we are all aware. And so it did remove that possibility that, you know, we would be thrust into a lot of additional drama. But I walked away with a pretty positive outlook over the whole experience. And when I close here in just a few minutes, I'm gonna read something that I wrote about the experience, because as a writer, once we've said something and we're happy with the way we've said it, we don't need to recreate the wheel. So I'll give you more of like in real time, this is how I was processing this. I'll end with that. But a couple other things that I'm just gonna kind of throw out in terms of what did I learn from this experience? I already knew that my neighborhood is a very complicated place. Does anybody happen to live in District 3 in this room? Okay. So when we would meet as a team, especially when we first started knocking on doors, people in the districts where Democrats won were just having the time of their lives outdoor knocking. They thought it was so much fun. It was such a fun way to just get out there, and they felt so supported. And I was sitting there like, it does not feel this way in my neighborhood. And so we spent a lot of time sort of campaigning with each other, particularly our at-large candidates would, you know, if I'm going out into District 3, some of them would join me. What I realized was, and there are a couple of districts that are more akin to my District 3. I was encountering, we don't want to speak with too broad a brush, and I understand that, and I want there to be some nuance, but I was speaking to what felt like two very distinct groups of people. And I'm talking about that politically. There was a language barrier with a lot of my neighbors. That was a challenge for me. I'm not a Spanish speaker, just minimal. And so it was helpful for me anytime I was able to have somebody with me translating. Sandra Rodriguez McMasters, Richard Aguirre, and others. They were just instrumental in just being able to kind of knock down that barrier. But there was a very evident political divide amongst my neighbors that was felt more strongly than it was in other places. And ultimately that bore out in the data behind, you know, this particular election. So I would run into people who had various concerns, neighbors who, I mean, there are plenty of houses in my neck of the woods that have kind of threatening signs up or threatening flags up, or, you know, kind of wearing their political ideologies on their sleeve, so to speak. Sometimes we would skip those houses, honestly, because it wasn't going to be fruitful. Other times we just went in, you know, we dug in and had those conversations. Despite the different things I was hearing from different neighbors, you know, some folks were concerned about these things, some folks were concerned about these things. And the political essence behind these feelings was strong for everybody. It was very obvious where people were getting their news from on various levels, and very evident to me. And yet, despite these complexities, despite the things that made it feel challenging and uncomfortable in some ways, I asked almost every person that I talked to, are you happy living in this neighborhood? And with maybe one or two exceptions, everybody said yes. And I found that very interesting because people were basically saying, oh, there's all these things wrong, you know, this and this and this and this. And we can imagine what those things might have been, right? We can imagine what various news sources were telling people the problems were that we were facing. And so they were, kind of repeating back to me these certain issues and these grievances that they had. But when I would say, because we live in a very integrated, very complicated, complex, diverse neighborhood, when I would say to people, but are you happy living here? Are you happy with this neighborhood? Yes, I am. Do you feel safe in this neighborhood? Yeah, I do. And so I noticed this disconnect between kind of what's happening up here and all the things that we're told to be wary of and be fearful of. And we're absorbing some of those things and repeating, ingesting and repeating some of those things. And yet down here at street level, where we're actually living our daily lives, people are happy, they're at peace. They would speak disparagingly sometimes about groups of people. And in the same breath, people represented in those disparaging comments were their next door neighbors, and they liked their next door neighbors. It illustrated for me the importance of us staying connected as people, as humans, not to be too overrun by what people on national news or national politicians are telling us to be afraid of, but to really get more serious about living our lives face to face with each other. I had to keep putting these off and on. That's my life now. One of the things I discovered in the aftermath, I guess, of the election, and this is a challenging one that I considered not mentioning, but why am I here if I'm not going to be honest with all of you? I discovered that even the most liberal voters among us were often still drawn to similarity more than belief. And I'm probably not going to say a whole lot about that. But the loss of Sandra Rodriguez McMasters was devastating for me. And I was saying along the way, I am more interested in Sandra winning this at-large seat as a Latina woman, a brilliant Latina woman. I'm more interested in her winning this seat than I am in me winning my seat. And the fact that she did not win that election said something important to all of us that we need to be paying attention to and listening to. I heard people being honest about the fact that it was, they were drawn to similarity. We are hardwired to be drawn to similarity, and it is to our detriment when we are not able to say, we might have these differences between people, when we're not able to say, it's not necessarily all about me. It's not all about us. It is about the health of this community. And that was just a hard one for me. It was a hard one to see that she was not able to carry that seat. And so I want to encourage us to think really hard about where we fall into that conversation, to be more willing to have hard conversations with the people around us, who might think the quote right things. We might believe the right things. We might believe representation really matters in a community that is increasingly Latino. We might believe that with our brains. When it comes time to cast that vote, are we willing to cast that vote? For, just as an example, one of the things I heard was there were folks who just said, well, yeah, she speaks with an accent. She's sometimes difficult for me to understand. That's hard for me, because she is very open and honest about her journey and her story, and she does speak with an accent. And you know what? Oh, that's a good thing. That's a good thing in Goshen. We can get beyond that. We have to be willing and activated and intentional about saying there might be differences between us and other people, but when we allow ourselves to distance ourselves from difference, even at the risk of our belief, we have to be willing to be honest about that. So the next time around, I am actively interested in us having a city council that more accurately represents us as a community. And that did not quite happen in the way I wanted it to. I discovered that the fair campaign pledge that we all signed, sometimes it's easier to present the optics of something than it is to actually carry those things out. And so there were challenges along the way with the ways some people engaged with that. And so I'm speaking very candidly and very honestly, because these are the things that matter when we are talking about our local democracy. It is one thing for people to say, I am going to conduct myself in a fair manner, and it's another thing to actually do that. And these are things we should be paying attention to as we are electing leaders throughout our community. So those are some of the more disappointing takeaways, because I think we have to be willing to be honest about that. As an author, when I have a book come out, we have after the book is fully launched, maybe 6 months, 8 months later, we have what we call, and this is terrible, I always wish we would find some better language for this. We call it a post-mortem. Do the post-mortem on the book. And we're sitting down and we're saying what went right and what went wrong. What could we have done better? What are the hard things that we wish we didn't have to talk about, but we really have to talk about them? And so again, there are similarities with something like a local election. We have to be willing to talk about the uncomfortable parts, the hard parts. We have to be willing to do that. And in the context of all of the things that were frustrating, all the things that were just a wonderful surprise, my absolute ultimate takeaway was that the disappointment of losing this campaign robbed me of nothing. It robbed me of nothing. I gained connection within my community. I gained the opportunity to knock on the door of so many of my neighbors. And that's something I care about. That's something I write about. That's something I believe really matters. And I had such a great opportunity to do that. I got to meet so many more of my neighbors. This is a side note, but one of my neighbors who was such a supporter of the campaign, she's a Spanish speaker. And again, I'm not. Sandra was with me and helped kind of translate. And this particular neighbor was so excited to be a part of this local democracy, to cast her vote, for her children in particular to cast their votes. She put all of our signs up along Main Street. And a couple of months after, the election was in November. 1 month later, in December, one of her children was in a severe car accident. He graduated with my son, Calvin, last year and was paralyzed from the chest down. And for me, I've just carried that heaviness every single day since hearing about this accident. This is what it means to be a community, that we can come together and care about some of the same things and have each other's backs and work together. And sometimes it means that we suffer, we bear each other's suffering together. And so even just having kind of that more recent connecting point with her and with her family made it ever more real to me when tragedy struck their family. And so this is what it means. This is why it matters for us to know each other and to be connected to each other. So I am going to read a couple little paragraphs. I write an online newsletter. It's under Substack. Some of you might have heard of Substack, some of you might not have, but it's basically an email newsletter. Some of you in this room are subscribers, and I really appreciate that. But it's sort of like blogging, like a blog post in the day. Now all that has kind of shifted into emails that land into your email inbox. If anybody wants that information, I'd be happy to give that out. And so after the election, I wrote sort of like my end all be all people were interested in my campaign. People thought that was pretty interesting that I was running. And I also just wanted to kind of memorialize, put kind of a signpost in this part of my life. I don't know that I will ever run again. I don't know. I hope I can remain open. And I also know it took a lot of time, and we've sort of discovered that maybe District 3 is not super winnable after all. But I just wanted to put my thoughts into words. As a writer, that's the best way I can process my life. And this is the very end of that post. I'm not going to begin to read all of it, but the last few paragraphs. I said, people in my neighborhood don't know me like social media does, because I'm writing mostly to people who do not live in Goshen. I'm writing to a really large number of people who live scattered all over the place. People in my neighborhood don't know me like social media does. I am not internet famous on Fifth Street. They don't follow me on social media. They do not have the slightest clue that I am an author. They don't see me wearing earrings or makeup, and they would give Shannon in a suit coat the side eye. If they know me at all, it is as the woman in the White House near the park. This is why I'm at peace with the outcome. Nothing changes except for the parts I want to change. Almost everyone on our team was a stranger to me less than 1 year ago. I am obsessed with knowing that they were here all along, and I just hadn't met them yet. Some of us will remain friends, and I'm grateful for that. Even more, it makes me aware of the infinite possibility located within city limits alone. This campaign clarified what matters most to me. What ultimately convinced me to run were the people I get to make lunch for twice a week, too often overlooked and underestimated. I was so ready to advocate on their behalf, and that does not have to change. The race was not close, but I am free to get closer, closer to the ground, closer to my neighbors, closer to the ones who know me best in a ball cap. Thanks to the past few months, I am closer to understanding how our city government works and more comfortable knowing where my voice might be valuable. Thanks to a humbling loss, I am closer to who I have always been, one ordinary woman who loves her community and believes in its possibility. So thank you all for your time. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to answer them. Is there anything that anyone would love to hear about?
First of all, thank you so much. I appreciate so much what you said and the spirit.
Yeah.
I have a specific question. Do you understand from the Hispanic, Spanish-speaking people?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sense of how many of them would have voted for you and how many would have voted for the?
Yeah.
The follow-up is, what is Spanish speakers information, where does it come from?
Yeah. It was a question throughout the campaign, especially at the end, this idea that we have to be engaging Latino voters. And what I would say to that, and what others around me would agree with, is that it's too late at that point. We have to be not as concerned about turning out Latino voters and more interested in connecting with our Latino neighbors throughout our lives. There is a very strong sense that I pick up on that our Latino voters do not feel a part of the process in the way that we would like them to feel. And even a sense of, oh, you care about us now? You want our votes now, and so now you suddenly care? And that's an indictment on every single one of us, I think. I don't quite know. I mean, I think I don't have a good sense of where are Latino voters getting their news. I think the Spanish-speaking radio stations are a big deal. The Spanish newspapers are a big deal. I think we have to be very mindful that while white voters are not a monolith, Latino voters are not in a monolith either. And so we saw a pretty wide representation of political belief among our Latino neighbors, and that should not surprise us. I mean, we can sit in a large room full of white people and expect that a lot of different beliefs are going to be represented. It's absolutely true within the Latino community. I just think my sense, this is just like my personal opinion, not founded on data. I think Latino people feel somewhat isolated and disconnected from our larger culture, from the democratic process, and it should not be that way. And so that's the work that we need to be doing every single day, all throughout our lives, finding ways to stay connected with Latino people. We should be visiting and patronizing the Hispanic grocery stores dotted throughout our community. I mean, there are some pretty easy access points that, even though they might not, sort of change the world, they will probably change us a little bit. And as we change and move closer to each other, this is long haul work. Because I just think it felt obvious to a lot of Latino voters that we suddenly cared about them when we wanted their vote. And that's no way for neighbors to live.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah.
I want you, part of the elected people in town, if you what
At large. Mhm.
would you run at
Well, I'm under a deadline. My next year or so is going to be a tricky one. That was another thing that immediately after I lost, people were saying, well, they did do that gerrymandering. That was the first thing. And the second thing they were saying was Shannon should run at large. I don't know. I talked to my treasurer after at the close of the campaign, and I said, I hope I don't run again. Because it just felt like a lot at that point in time. And so there's part of me that is like, oh, I cannot imagine. The workload for an at-large candidate is just multiplied. The amount of work, Linda, I'm so glad Linda was elected. Richard, all of our at-large candidates, but Gina, still devastated, forever devastated that Sandra didn't win. The amount of work they put in was astronomical. So we'll see. Yeah. Was there another? Oh, yeah, sure.
Regarding Hispanic voting, how many are actually registered to vote?
That's a good question. I keep waiting for this exit data to be coming out. And the last I heard, they still did not have real specific information for that. But what I can say is, aside, we're very interested in, and I am too, I'm very interested, especially in my neighborhood, to know the exit data on Latino voters. It's murky. I mean, it's complicated for a number of reasons. But what I would remind us is citywide voter turnout is 20%, maybe. In my district, in District 3, we have the lowest, or historically we have, I think, having the Republican running for mayor, I think that drove out more Republican voters that ultimately really helped carry some Republican candidates over the line. So that might be different this time around. But District 3 has about 13 to 15% voter turnout. And so I think we should be reluctant to get too hung up on Latino voters, and we should be talking about why citywide voter turnout is so low. I have opinions on that. I think most of us, myself included, I mean, I had Latino neighbors who voted early for me, who put signs out for me, who were excited to take their whole family and their 18-year-old daughter and vote for me. And weeks later, they said to me, so did you win? And so it was this idea of like, yeah, we want to be a part of this, but I think most people don't really, most people are not living in local politics, that we are not aware. We don't understand whether, regardless of our race or ethnicity, we don't really understand the point of city government. We don't see it at work, and we don't see it at work for us. And so it becomes more a question of, why should I care? Why does this matter to me? And that's the question I'm asking myself, is what can I do? Whether I run for election again or not, what can I be doing to help people understand why this matters in the first place? Most people across the board do not know an answer to that.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Sure.
And thank you so much for running. I was sure rooting for you and for Sandra. But
Thanks.
about running, even if you lose, is that you get certain issues out there that need
Yeah.
up and that people don't know about.
Yeah.
Even if you lose, which is probably very devastating, that's important. It's so disappointing to go and vote and see no Democrat there that is running.
Yeah, I know. And that's part of the rub, is that it's going to be challenging to get good quality candidates to run in districts where it feels kind of impossible to win. I mean, and that's where we fall into people just not running and not even having a candidate that you can vote for. And I understand both sides of that now, because it is just a heavy lift to, I mean, I think of Rachel Mercado. She ran in District 2, I think. Was she District 2? And that woman poured her heart and soul. She's got young little kids. I mean, she's just at a phase of life that's different even than mine, with older, more independent kids. And it was almost an impossibility for her to win that district, and she ran. And that is admirable. You know, for somebody to say, I am fighting an uphill battle. There's probably no chance I can win. And she tried it anyway. I think the thing that will help is for more of us to be talking now about why city council matters and what city council does, and why, you know, what are the decisions that are, I saw a lot of people confusing federal issues up here, or saying, you know, oh, I could never vote for a Democrat because of these things happening up here. And those are conversations maybe worth having, but local politics it's operating on a different parameter. It's just the issues are not quite the same. They might be in some cases, but people just don't have a real good sense of what local politics is and why it matters. So that's work we can all be doing now. And if we can get voter turnout up across the board, that changes things in terms of who can win and what seats are winnable and all those kinds of things, so that we can be getting more quality candidates in the pool.
You were gerrymandered, but you also didn't have an R beside your name, and you're a woman.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah. And so whatever we can do to be changing some of those things, changing perception around those things, is helpful.
It's on.
I can repeat the question, Al.
Okay.
Yeah.
The teacher side can speak loudly.
Okay.
Thank you for your book, for running for office, and for your passion for Sandra.
Yeah.
They believed in what she was.
Yeah.
You think she'll run again?
I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. She has spoken really candidly throughout the process that even if she had won, she would sit one term, because she was very interested. She's just a fantastic woman.
She was interested in serving as an example for other Latino people about what it looks like to be a part of the process. She was not interested in winning that seat and then camping out in it for a long time. She wanted to be a mentor to other people. And my hunch is, I mean, I would love to see her run again. My hunch is that if she doesn't run again, she will be interested in mentoring other Latino candidates who might be interested in running. And that's something, if and when you see that happening, find ways to support those candidates. It is vitally important, vitally important. Her story, I mean, I don't know, were any of you at the candidate forum at the Goshen Theater? Yeah. That was illuminating in so many different ways. And I think you can still pull it up on YouTube, even if you're interested in seeing it. But she did such a good job of being really open about her story. Her story is just representative of a lot of the stories in the community, and being willing to say, you know, she's got her master's degree and is working at Oaklawn. And I mean, she did that later in life, more recently. And she said, I had to get a tutor for every single class because, I mean, she was fighting against language barriers. She was a mom at the time. I mean, she was working full-time in a factory at the time. She has done amazing things, and she knows she's an example to many members of the community of how they can choose to be an active participant in local democracy. So yeah, when you see candidates putting themselves out there, please find ways to support that.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you for.
Thank you, Mark. Yes.
And we're glad to hear that many people, while they believe the country stinks, their neighborhood's pretty.
Right, that's it. Yes.